King Arthur is probably the most iconic symbol of British identity in history. The sword in the stone, the round table, Camelot, the knights, the whole thing. Over 1,000 years of books, movies, poems, operas, and political propaganda, and almost every version of it gets one thing wrong. Arthur wasn't British, he was Roman. The evidence has been sitting in plain sight for a century, carved into stone, studied by actual scholars, and largely ignored by the version of history that most people get. That's what this video is about. But first, today's video is brought to you by Ideogram, the image generator that looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You want a Roman cavalry officer? Here's a man in armor with the jaw of a Greek god, the hands of a toddler, and a horse that appears to be melting. Ideogram, I could not do this without you. The images in this video are going to be a journey, and that journey was intentional. Mostly. Now, I've been doing this long enough that I can kind of predict the comments before I upload, so let me just address some of those now. Why do the images look so weird? Ideogram, see above. No budget, no interest in copyright strikes. I've made my peace with it. So look, if a Roman legionary shows up looking like he lost a fight with a rendering engine, enjoy it and keep watching. The history is real, but my visual budget is a work of fiction. Maybe this isn't historically accurate. Well, all of my sources are pinned in the first comment and listed in the description. All of them. Go read them. Maybe King Arthur was definitely British. I watched Excalibur. That's a bold research strategy. Respect. All jokes aside, the sources matter. Everything in this video is backed by real academic work. Go read it, disagree with it, and bring something better to the comments. That's what this channel is, facts over feelings. With all of that said, I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Arnie's Brain Train. Let's get into it. To understand how Arthur might be Roman, you have to understand what Rome actually did to Britain. Not the textbook version, not Romans built some roads and then left, but the full picture of what 400 years of occupation actually looks like. So, Julius Caesar made two expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BC, but they were more reconnaissance than conquest. He showed up, roughed up a few tribes, collected some tribute, got pushed around a bit more than Roman propaganda would later admit, and then left. Both sides declared victory and moved on. But Caesar turned the whole thing into one of antiquity's great pieces of self-promotional literature. The actual conquest came nearly 100 years later in 43 AD, when Emperor Claudius, a man who had been pulled out of hiding by the Praetorian Guard and essentially forced onto the throne and desperately needed a military win to legitimize his reign, sent 4 legions under General Aulus Plautius across the Channel. Claudius himself showed up for the ceremonial entry into Colchester, stayed for 11 days to make sure he got the triumph, and then went back to Rome and let the real work begin. Within a generation, Rome had transformed southern Britain in ways that are difficult to overstate. Over 2,000 miles of roads were built, straight engineered roads with drainage ditches and layered stone foundations, many of which are still the underlying routes of modern British highways. Latin became the language of law, commerce, and administration. Roman religion blended with local Celtic traditions, producing hybrid deities like Sulis Minerva at Bath, where the Roman goddess of wisdom merged with the local Celtic goddess of the hot springs. They built cities where there had been hill forts. Londinium becomes London, Eboracum becomes York, Aquasolus becomes Bath, as well as contributing other public baths, amphitheaters, temples, forum complexes, a monetary economy, standardized weights and measures, written law, and bureaucratic administration. A Briton living in the south of England in 100 AD would have lived a more recognizably Roman life than a Celtic one. And this went on for almost 400 years. The United States has only existed for about 250. So by the time Rome left Britain, there were families who had been Roman for 10, 12, 15 generations. People whose great-great-great-grandparents had never known anything but Roman civilization. The idea that Rome packed up and left, and Britain just snapped back to his pre-Roman Celtic identity is simply not supported by the evidence. You can see how deep it went by looking at what's still standing. Like Hadrian's Wall, 73 miles of stone fortification, built starting in 122 AD, still stretches across northern England, and you can walk it today. The Roman baths at Bath are still functioning, with the same springs flowing through them that the Roman soldiers bathed in nearly 2,000 years ago. The road from London to York, Ermine Street, follows such a perfectly straight Roman alignment that the modern A1 highway uses the same route. And when construction workers dig foundations anywhere in the square mile of the city of London, they routinely hit Roman artifacts, walls, and floors. Roman London is just below the surface, constantly interrupting the 21st century. Rome didn't just pass through this island. It embedded itself so deeply that 1600 years of subsequent history hasn't managed to be able to remove it. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain with a message that essentially said, "You're on your own, defend yourselves, Rome isn't coming back." Historians debate exactly what the letter was meant and who it was addressed to. Some actually argue that it was directed at the cities in Italy rather than Britain, and the attribution is genuinely complicated. But the result on the ground was the same regardless. The legions were progressively withdrawn to defend the crumbling empire closer to home. By 407 AD, a general named Constantine III had already stripped most of the remaining garrison from Britain to pursue his own imperial ambitions on the continent. The tax systems that had funded the roads, the walls, and the garrisons evaporated. The infrastructure Rome had spent 400 years building began to decay without anyone to maintain it. But it didn't collapse overnight, and this is one of the most persistent misconceptions about what people call the Dark Ages. Archaeologists and historians have been pushing back on the lights out in 410 narrative for decades. Roman towns kept functioning for years, sometimes decades after the official withdrawal. The language, the laws, and the cultural frameworks persisted in fragmented and degraded but recognizable forms for generations. The Church, which had become a Roman institution under Constantine, maintained Latin literacy and Roman organizational structures long after the legions left. What changed was the security situation. With the military gone, Britain was exposed from multiple directions at once. Raids from Ireland in the west, raids from Pictish tribes in the north, and from the east, something more sustained than raids. The Angles from what is now Denmark and northern Germany, the Saxons from the coastal regions of modern Germany and the Netherlands, and the Utes from the Jutland Peninsula. They came not just as raiders, but as settlers, farmers looking for land. The popular image of savage hordes destroying Roman civilization in a sudden wave is a significant oversimplification. The migration was slower and messier than that, and genetic studies of ancient DNA from this period confirm a genuine population shift with significant influx of North European ancestry into Eastern Britain. What those settlers found when they arrived was a landscape saturated with Roman material culture that they had no framework to understand. Stone buildings that they didn't know how to build, roads that they didn't know how to maintain, and bath complexes and heating systems and aqueducts representing engineering traditions that they simply had been lost in the transfer. An Anglo-Saxon poet standing in the ruins of Bath, we have this in the Old English poem The Ruin, describes what he's looking at as almost supernatural, the work of a race of beings greater than ordinary men, now vanished. The engineering knowledge required to build those structures was gone, and in its absence, the ruins became myth. That's the world in which the legend of Arthur begins to take shape. Romano-British survivors and Anglo-Saxon newcomers sharing the ruins of civilization neither of them fully understood. A population 15 generations deep into Roman identity, now trying to figure out who they are without Rome. In that context, the memory of a great Romano-British military commander who held the line wouldn't fade quietly. It would be kept alive deliberately and preserved as a tool. Here's the name: Lucius Artorius Castus. He was a real Roman military officer who served in Britain probably between 170 and 185 AD, and we know he existed because we have inscriptions, like physical evidence carved in stone. One found in Pastrana, in modern-day Croatia, his hometown, describes his career in detail. He commanded a detachment of Sarmatian cavalry stationed in Britain, served as Prefectus, commander of the 6th Legion Victrix based at York, and led a military campaign into Armorica, which is modern-day Brittany in France. A second fragmentary inscription confirms elements of this career. Now, why does this matter for Arthur? Well, start with the name. Artorius is rare in the Roman historical record, appearing infrequently enough that it makes a strong linguistic candidate for the origin of Arthur. The phonetic evolution from Artorius to Arthur through Welsh, where the name appears as Arthur in early sources, follows completely standard patterns of sound change that comparative linguists who specialize in Romano-British name transmission have traced in detail. Then we have the cavalry connection, which is arguably even more significant. Arthur in the earliest Welsh traditions is described as a cavalry commander, a leader of mounted warriors who could strike rapidly across long distances. You know, the Knights of the Round Table and all. But that's not a typical Dark Age British war leader profile. That's a Roman military concept. Castus specifically commanded Sarmatian cavalry, horse warriors from the steppe region north of the Black Sea who had been settled in Britain by Emperor Marcus Aurelius after being defeated in the Marcomannic Wars. These Sarmatians brought with them their own cultural traditions, including a dragon war standard, a mounted combat culture, and origin myths involving a hero, a magical sword thrown into a lank, and warriors sworn to serve. If any of that sounds familiar, and it should, you're not imagining the connection. Beyond the name and the cavalry, Castus's broader career profile matches what the legend describes. He fought external enemies threatening Roman Britain during a period of genuine military pressure on the province. He was exactly the kind of figure who gets remembered and celebrated by the communities he protected, and exactly the kind who gets mythologized by their descendants once the civilization he represented has collapsed. This is what scholars like Kent Malone in 1925 and later Linda Malcor argued in detail. That Arthur isn't one man, but a composite, built on top of one or more real historical figures through a process that we've looked at before on this channel, like in the video where I compared Samson to Hercules, where a character gets mythologized over centuries, absorbing motifs from neighboring cultures until the historical figure underneath becomes almost unrecognizable. The seeds get planted, the storytelling tradition cultivates it for generations, and by the time Geoffrey of Monmouth is writing his History of the Kings of Britain around 1138, you can't see the original tree for the forest. Now, the Artorius as Arthur theory is compelling and it has serious academic defenders, but it's not universally accepted. Some historians argue that the name connection is coincidental. Some argue that the 2nd century timeline is too early, that the Arthur's legendary battles against the Saxons point to a 5th or 6th century figure. The historian Guy Halsall argues that the historical Arthur is essentially unrecoverable, and that looking for the real Arthur is the wrong question entirely. And these are legitimate positions. The historical record for 5th and 6th century Britain is sparse, and what survives has been heavily filtered through later agendas. But what I can tell you is that Artorius Castus is the strongest individual candidate that we currently have, and the case fits the Roman-British context better than alternatives that require us to invent a Celtic warrior king with no archaeological trace whatsoever. Sources are in the description. Read them, push back. That's the whole point of this channel. So if Artorius Castus, or someone like him, was the historical seed of the Arthur legend, how did that seed survive 600 years to end up in Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century history? The answer is Wales, or more precisely, the Romano-British population that got pushed westward into Wales and Cornwall as Anglo-Saxon settlement expanded through the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. The Anglo-Saxons called these people Wales, meaning foreigners or outsiders, which is where we get the word Welsh. But just think about the irony for a second. The indigenous population of Britain, people who had been there for millennia, were labeled as foreigners by the people who had just moved in. These were communities clinging to Roman identity, Latin literacy, and Christian faith as markers of civilization in contrast to the pagan Germanic peoples who had taken their lands. For them, the memory of a Romano-British war leader who had fought back against that wasn't just a story. It was a political tool and a way of saying, we were great once, we resisted, and we can resist again. If you watched my books about the lost books of the Bible, you've seen this dynamic before. How Nathan's Chronicles, Gad the Seer's records, and the Book of the Wars of the Lord survived in fragments precisely because threatened communities kept them alive when powerful institutions wanted them gone. The Welsh monks and bards who preserved the Arthur tradition were just doing the same thing. The earliest references to Arthur in surviving texts comes from this Welsh tradition. Nennius, writing his Historia Britonum around 830 AD, mentions Arthur as Dux Bellorum, a battle leader, notably not a king, who fought 12 battles against the Saxons, culminating at Badon Hill. The battle count is legendary exaggeration, but Badon Hill itself appears in earlier sources, including Gilda's 6th century account, and may have been a real event, as a real last stand of Romano-British resistance. The Welsh poem, a Godolphin, possibly dating to the late 6th or early 7th century, contains a passing reference to Arthur as the standard of martial valor, not a mythological figure, but a cultural touchstone that the audience is already expected to know, the way that you might compare a fighter to someone legendary. In this early tradition, Arthur isn't a fairy tale king, he's a memory. But, crucially, none of these references describe a court. Not one mentions Camelot, a round table, or knights questing for holy relics. The round table first appears in Wasse's French adaptation of Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1155. The Holy Grail appears in Chrétien de Troyes in the 1180s, a French poet working in a French courtly tradition. And Guinevere, Lancelot, their affair, all just French romantic convention layered onto a much older story. Even Merlin, as we know him, is largely Geoffrey of Monmouth's construction. So strip all of that medieval accretion away, and what you have underneath is a Roman-trained military commander who led British resistance against Saxon invaders. That's simply what the oldest sources actually describe. Now let's talk about the Vikings, because almost nobody connects them to Rome, and they should. And then we need to talk about what the Normans did with Arthur, because that's where the whole story finally lands. When the Vikings begin raiding Britain in earnest starting around 793 AD, the sack of Lindisfarne so shocking it was recorded across Europe as a sign of divine punishment, they are not arriving in a post-Roman blank slate. They're walking into a landscape shaped by 400 years of Roman occupation, followed by another 350 years of Anglo-Saxon culture built on top of Roman foundations. The cities that they're raiding were built by Romans. When they shift from raiding to settlement in the second half of the 9th century, the great heathen army that landed in 865 AD and systematically took the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia didn't build new cities. They took over existing ones. York, Jorvik to the Vikings, is the former Roman city of Aboracum, the most important Roman city in northern Britain, the base of the 6th Legion, and the city where Constantine the Great was proclaimed emperor in 306 AD. The Vikings didn't know most of that history, but they could see the walls and they could walk the street grid the Romans had laid out, and they used it. Jorvik under Viking rule became one of the most cosmopolitan trading cities in northern Europe, built on a Roman skeleton. Lincoln, Leicester, and Chester, all former Roman foundations, developed by Anglo-Saxons and now inherited by Scandinavians. 3 layers of civilization stacked on the same Roman base. And military historians studying the great heathen army's campaigns note that their movements across Britain follow Roman road networks with striking precision. They were exploiting infrastructure built by people dead for 400 years. So the Vikings inherit Rome without realizing it, and then their descendants, the Normans, go one step further and weaponize Rome's most famous ghost. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, Arthur had become a symbol of British identity in the Welsh and Anglo-Saxon tradition. The Normans, as foreign conquerors, needing to legitimize their rule over the English and Welsh, recognized the value in that symbol immediately. Henry II promotes the claim that Glastonbury Abbey contains Arthur's tomb, conveniently discovered in 1191, right at the moment when the Normans needed to demonstrate that Arthur was dead and not coming back to reclaim Britain for the Celtic Britons. Then Edward I, a century later, uses Arthurian imagery systematically to claim dominion over Wales and Scotland, holding round-table tournaments and taking what he claims is Arthur's crown to London as a trophy. Rome's ghost, wearing British armor, doing political work for Viking-descended Norman rulers on a Roman-built island. History doesn't really repeat itself, but it plagiarizes constantly. So here's the full chain of what we've covered today. Rome occupies Britain for 400 years and embeds itself so deeply into the landscape, the language, the religion, and the military culture that it simply cannot be removed. Rome withdraws in the early 5th century, and the Romano-British population, 15 generations deep into Roman identity, watches their world collapse around them. They retreat west into Wales and Cornwall, and they keep their memories alive through stories, through poetry, and through the church. One of those memories is a cavalry commander named Artorius who held the line. That memory gets mythologized across generations into something bigger, a war leader becoming a king, becoming a legend. The Anglo-Saxons, who inherited the ruins of Roman Britain, build their culture on the foundations that they don't fully understand. The Vikings who come after them do the same thing. And then the Norman kings, Viking blood on a Roman-built island, take the Arthur legend and weaponize it as a tool of political legitimacy, dressing it in chivalric armor and pointing it at anyone who questions their right to rule. The distance between Lucius Artorius Castus, Roman cavalry commander of the 2nd century AD, and King Arthur, legendary British monarch, eternal symbol of national identity, is 1500 years of human beings using stories to survive, claim power, and make sense of collapse. And yet, the version of it that most people know isn't even close to the real story. Well, that's it, everybody. King Arthur, the most British of British legends, built on a Roman foundation, preserved by Welsh survivors, hijacked by Norman kings who were themselves descended from Vikings, and handed down to us as something ancient and purely English. As always, sources are pinned in the first comment and in the description. Books, academic papers, primary texts, all of it. Read them and find something that I got wrong and bring it to the comments. That's how this channel gets better. Finally, if you got something out of this video, subscribe to Arnie's Brain Train and hit the bell. If there's anything you want to see me improve, the production, the research, or just the way that I present this stuff, leave that below too. I'm Alex Arnold, and remember, the world isn't always this simple, but it's always this interesting. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.